A historic moment. The United States state of Mississippi votes to remove Confederate insignia from its flag, a symbol of its racist past. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Statues and monuments honoring racist figures continue to fall across the United States and around the world. U.S. President Trump is pushing back against protesters and, in an act of defiance, signed an executive order punishing those who damaged or destroyed federal monuments. There is lots to discuss. Let's get straight to our panel. Cherise Smith is Chair and Associate Professor of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Joining us here in Washington, Jaleel Brown is a graphic designer at SightCrafted. He has also taken part in anti-racism protests in the city. Walter D. Donnie Kennedy is Chief of Heritage Operations with the Sons of Confederate Veterans. He joins us from New Orleans in Louisiana. And also with us in Washington via Skype, Lucia Araujo is a history professor and Director of Graduate Studies at Howard University. Welcome to all of you to the show. Cherise Smith, let me start with you. In the wake of these protests against police brutality, which we've seen around the country, there have been calls now to remove statues and monuments of Confederate leaders, others who are seen as being racist. And as I just said, lawmakers in the U.S. state of Mississippi have voted to remove the Confederate battle emblem from the state flag. How significant is that?
The removal of the flag of Mississippi is a very important step toward righting very many wrongs that have been done to African Americans in this country, formerly enslaved people and the descendants of formerly enslaved people. So I think it's a very positive thing that the Mississippi government has taken that step.
What do you make of the fact, Cherise, that this took place in Mississippi, which is one of the more conservative states here?
It's extremely symbolic. It is just a very significant and important thing that they've done that signals for the rest of the country, especially the rest of the southern United States, that significant action must be taken.
Donnie Kennedy, what do you make of these calls to remove statues and monuments, or in the case of Mississippi, to change that flag?
Well, first of all, I noticed at your beginning, you already tagged us as racist people because we love the Confederacy and love the South. You'll have to remember that we of the South, we are a defeated people. We don't have anybody to speak for us. No one speaks for us. And for some reason, our detractors have the opportunity and pleasure of defining what our symbols really mean. To us, and this goes for a large number of African American, as well as Hispanic, as well as Native Americans, that flag and those symbols are part of our history and our heritage. The Sons of Confederate Veterans has many, many diverse citizens of all races, ethnic backgrounds. We are proud of those symbols, and we see those symbols as something to look up to, not something to look down on. And as I said, we're the only minority in the United States that does not have the privilege of telling who we are. Somebody else, our enemies and detractors, are the ones who define who we are and what our symbols represent.
Well, that's why you're here, Donnie, to tell us what you think. But do you understand the view of those who regard those symbols as being racist?
Yes, sir, I do, because we do not get to tell our side of the story. As I said, as a defeated people, we have the government, the victor, telling our side of the story. We don't get to tell our side. So I can understand why people would see, if they've only been told that something is horrible, yes, they're going to believe that. But give us a chance. The South has always pleaded, you don't have to agree with us, but give us a chance to tell our side of the story. One of those monuments you're talking about is in Jackson, Mississippi, and when it was raised, every black representative in the state legislature voted for the funding of that monument. And one of them, John F. Harris, he spoke and said, I too wore the gray, the same color as my master. And he went on saying those men, including himself and other black Confederates, deserve that monument. So I don't see how you can say that's a racist monument when you have black representatives voting to fund that monument.
Cherise, you want to respond to what Walter just said?
I would tend to disagree with Walter's point, or with Donnie's point, that southern United States are a beleaguered people who've not had any say in how they represent themselves. The fact that there are Confederate sculptures and statues all over the country, and especially not even in the South, would tend to disagree with that point. In fact, Confederate sculptures around the country testify to what the Confederacy stood for, and partially that is the enslavement of black people.
All right, let me bring Jaleel into the conversation. Jaleel, you took part in some of the protests that took place in Washington and around the country. Protesters themselves have been removing some of these statues. This is how President Trump has responded to that. Let's listen.
They've created bedlam. They've destroyed very important things. I mean, you're also talking about statues of George Washington, Abraham Lincoln. They'd like to get Jesus, you know that, right? They said, we want to get Jesus.
You had Sean King, the radical,
These are nothing to do with any particular event other than they're troublemakers, they're agitators, and they're anarchists. The big thing they want is they want to really destabilize our country, and we don't let them.
So, Jaleel, what do you make of what the president said, and also to Donnie's point that this is part of American history?
Well, I find it peculiar that it would be identified as a part of American history, because history is not preserved only through monuments. There's several ways and mediums to preserve history. What this does is it honors and exalts certain characters who were a part of the Confederacy or a part of a very shameful part of this country's history. And I actually find it offensive that Donnie feels he can speak for the black people who live in the South, and a lot of the black population of this country is concentrated densely in the South. As a person who grew up in between the states of North Carolina and Georgia for a very large part of my childhood, I completely disagree that the black residents of the South would agree with anything that Donnie has stated regarding these symbols being something that we would support and uphold. And I further must say that these symbols represent something much more deeper and intrinsic and crucially wrong with the infrastructure of this country. And that point cannot be ignored while we discuss these symbols. We have to also make sure we know what they represent.
Go ahead, Donnie, you want to say something?
Could I make a point here? We're talking about slavery as if slavery is unique to the South. Remember, slavery lasted for 70 years longer in Massachusetts than it lasted in Mississippi. And it lasted for 72 years longer in New York than it lasted in Alabama. Quit beating on the South and acting like the South is the only one that ever had the institution of slavery. So let's don't just pick on the South about this issue. Slavery is a universal issue. There's not a color, creed in this world that has not either been a slave or have owned slaves. So this is not something that is owned by the South.
All right, I want to move on. Ana Lucia, of course, this is a movement that is not just confined to the United States. We see this in other parts of the world as well. We see statues of colonial-era leaders being removed in countries like the United Kingdom, in Belgium as well. They've removed statues there. And if we look at Germany, in Europe, they've removed all vestiges of Nazism over there. Is it time to get rid of many of these symbols, these statues, these monuments, which many regard as racist, or will they cause even more divisions?
The divisions are there and have been there since the arrival of Europeans in the Americas and the establishment of the Atlantic slave trade. And this is when what you can call white supremacy as an ideology, as a system emerged. Then this is why it's fallacious when you compare the slavery, chattel slavery in the Americas with the idea that slavery existed everywhere. Because in this country, that is the United States, for example, slavery existed, chattel slavery, then you are talking about a specific group of people who are enslaved. Slavery, of course, existed in the North, but is in the South there that segregation remained. And colonization then emerges as a consequence of the Atlantic slave trade. Then this is part of a continuum. And this is why then Black populations in Europe, in Belgium, in England, in France, in Portugal, they are also joining this movement to eliminate these monuments that were built, it is true, in most part of the cases, without consulting any Black citizen. Anybody who is going to spread the idea that these monuments were built with the approval and that Black citizens, they were asking to honor King Leopold of Belgium, who is responsible overall for killing about 10 million Africans in Congo, is really lying, and you need to state that. I am a historian, and we work with documents, we work with evidence, and we are not working here on a novel or a story or a beautiful film like Gone with the Wind that tells this beautiful story of the South as a place where Black people lived happy and they loved living under slavery. And this is the same when you are talking about then France or England or even the case of Belgium, that is also contesting its colonial past.
Cherise, what do you make of the argument that the removal of these statues or symbols, for better or for worse, they actually mark a period of a country's history, and that they, in some respects, may serve as a reminder of the dark past of this country or any other country?
I think that's an important case to be made. I do feel as though all of the sculptures that have littered the entire United States do not need to remain. I think that some of them should certainly be put in museums, and contextualization, documents, interviews, and the like, to have people understand what those symbols stood for, what the events and actions were that specific individuals took, positive and negative, might be presented. I also think that it's an interesting idea to think about what might go in the place of those monuments and sculptures that are removed. Perhaps we have other artists who will make other artworks and or sculptures to put there. And then I also think that we might also have artists come and do something with sculptures that exist where they are already. And still, there are works that have been added to with graffiti and other things that might stand exactly as they are, and then kind of educational framework around those kinds of interventions. So I think that there are a lot of ways to engage with those sculptures that include removing them and keeping them.
Donnie, of course, this is a very controversial political issue. President Trump tweeted, he said, "I just had the privilege of signing a very strong executive order protecting American monuments, memorials, and statues, and combating recent criminal violence. Long prison terms for those lawless acts against our great country." What do you make of the president saying that? Should he be saying things like that?
Well, as far as I'm concerned, any lawlessness should not be tolerated. But, people will have a right to express themselves. And I definitely believe that people who do not like something have a right to express themselves. What they do not have a right to do is to vandalize things. And that's the difference between peaceful expression and vandalization. So I would probably say, yeah, I'm probably more inclined to agree with him than disagree with him on that. But remember, these monuments are not monuments to gods. They are monuments to fallible human beings. We do not put monuments up to people because they're angels. We put them up because we know that they have done some evil in their life. We all do, but they are exceptional in certain areas. Let us learn the exceptional good and also the exceptional bad. We can learn a lot. The only people that want to tear down monuments, I'm afraid, are people who are afraid of learning both sides of the story. Each man needs to be judged both for the good and the bad.
Jaleel, what do you make of that?
Again, I have to disagree. For one, I think that to say that these people have good deeds and that we should simply not pay attention to or see the evil deeds that they have done as an afterthought, that to me states that Black lives and the Black lives lost, oppressed, and abused were an afterthought and continue to be an afterthought for the people who support these monuments. And I think that the statement that Donnie made earlier about slavery being something that was done everywhere in the world does not speak to the cruelty and the inhumane degree to which the transatlantic slave trade elevated slavery towards. Nowhere else in the world is there are people who have been stripped of their history, their heritage, their religion, their language, and so many other aspects of their culture.
Let me ask you something then. All those slaves that was brought over here, do you realize that only 6% ended up in the United States? 94% ended up in Cuba,
Do you realize how many of
Brazil,
them
and
died during the transatlantic slave trade?
Why did? Absolutely, I do, because I don't like those
That's why
Yankees
there's such
were
a low
doing
percentage.
And they were in the South American, Latin America. Why aren't you burning down statues in Brazil? Many more Africans went to Brazil than ever to the United States.
You do not know what I do in the work that I have done that affects the outside of this country. You could let me speak. I'm let you speak. I let you speak. You do not know the work that I have done that affects the outside of this country, so you do not speak on it. On top of that, I live in this country, so of course I'm going to be more partial to the issues that are happening in this country. And again, like I stated earlier, I lived in the South for an extended period of time and dealt with racism in the South from people who seem similar to you. So that is why I have such a passion for the things that go on in this country. My people built this country and laid the foundation.
Also,
let me bring Anna into this conversation. Anna, what do you make of what you've been hearing here?
Yes, I think there are several points here that are interesting. And I'm very happy that you are having this conversation with such opposed point of views. First of all, why do we build monuments? It's because people, they did good and bad things? No, it's not because of that. People, groups such as the Sons of the Confederacy, they gathered themselves in a particular moment and they decided to build monuments to fulfill a political agenda of that monument, that moment. They are not doing that to honor an individual in particular or because of the good things that individual did. They are doing because they have their own goals. Now, the question to ask here is the following. In the United States is one of the biggest slave societies in the Americas. It's not because only 300,000 enslaved Africans landed here, that slavery here was not significant. Then there were people here who were born from the wombs of enslaved women and who became enslaved all their lives and their descendants as well. Now, my colleague asked about why we don't remove monuments in Brazil, for example. Then I answered the question. There are already a lot of solidarity, Black solidarity in Brazil to what is happening here, because Brazil is a country where racism and white supremacy is also present. But we do not have in Brazil this large number that you are talking about, hundreds of monuments that honor people who defended the slavery. We do not have them.
Yeah. Okay.
Present.
Go ahead.
Dozens of monuments honoring people who were former slaves.
And to echo what you're saying, I think that it's important to note that a lot of these monuments, when they were erected, like you said, they were erected during a time to send a political message. They were erected at the same time as black codes were being implemented and as black people who were elected to a political office were being stripped of their positions after Reconstruction ended in the South. So I think that it's important to note the climate that was going on when these monuments were being erected, and that is the true motive behind them, not simply to honor and preserve legacy, but to send a message that states that the same message that was enforced by the Confederacy, the same message that was enforced by slave owners, that black people are not the primary people in this country and that we are an afterthought, even though we are the ones who built this country.
All right. Cherise, there are those who argue that monuments should be kept not just as a reminder of the past, but as a gesture of reconciliation as well. I mean, if we look at South Africa, which is where I am from, the Fort Rucker Monument, which one newspaper in the United States described as a great temple of apartheid, it still stands outside Pretoria, the capital of the country. And that was with the agreement of both white Afrikaners as well as the black majority in the country. Do they have a point?
They have a point in that there was agreement by both the majority culture and the minority culture, the empowered and the disempowered, to agree together to keep those sculptures. What we have here is, here in the United States, is that there have been white supremacists and white power organizations who have had more money, more power, more authority to push their will onto the rest of the country. And so if we'd like to, as citizenry, get together to decide which should stay and which should not, well, then that might be one thing. As it stands, though, what we have are large groups of people who are now feeling rightly angry with the state of affairs, and they're not willing to talk at this point, and instead they're willing to take action, which is, at this point, probably the right thing.
Donnie, do you agree with what Cherise has suggested, that people should get together and talk about these things, and there should be agreement on whether statues and monuments should remain?
Yeah, I do, because I think there are many cases, especially in cities and towns where the demographics have changed. A group of people may not want a monument. So let's get together. They say, well, let's move this monument to an area where people will respect it or do want it. Or they may not want it at all. In that case, we'll get rid of it. But it needs to be done in a civil manner, and we need to decide. You have to remember there's two sides to every coin. I never got a nickel in my life that didn't have two sides. I'm sure my friend who is as passionate as I am about his argument realized that there's people like me that have a different point of view. We all need to come to an agreement that one is not going to dominate the other. We've got to work together on these things.
Anna, what could you tell us about the German example? I mean, as I said earlier on, Germany has decided that it will remove all vestiges of its Nazi past, a very sordid part of its history. But it's made education in schools, the Nazi history as well as the Holocaust especially, that's mandatory in all German schools.
Yes, I think that is an interesting example to look at. But the context in Germany, when these monuments, they were removed, it was in the context then of foreign occupation, and Germany lost the war, and then the Allies, they occupied the country. It is in this process that the so-called denazification occurred, and these monuments are removed. This is not the case here. Then the case in the United States is still in the context of one single country, and different who are still fighting to have their point of view prevailing. But I think that what is important also for us to have in mind, and I think that she brought element as well, is that in the current context, the people, they are not in the climate of having this conversation. This conversation has been going on for several decades, and in most cases, there was no solution. Then protesters, they are doing that, and then just now that we want to start to have a conversation about what to do with the monuments. Now, of course, monuments, again, are the tip of the iceberg, and to have the story solved or to recount with this past, we would need, for example, to make it mandatory the teaching of an African American history in schools, and teach this history of the Civil War as it is, and not
may I?
Yes,
through moments that manipulate the history.
Okay, go ahead, Cherise.
I was just going to say that I think that the cases in South Africa and in Germany are very interesting cases, and in each of them there has been responsibility that has been acknowledged and some sense of real damage that has been done to the individuals who were either subjugated or killed in the case of the Holocaust. No such understanding has been made by the dominant power, who are for the most part white people in this country. And so if we can't actually get to the point where people acknowledge responsibility for wrongs that were done, one group to another group, then we are left in a challenging situation. And so we are in different cases, different environments here in the United States than in South Africa and in Germany.
Jaleel, is there a risk that while there is this big focus on monuments and statues, on the removal of these symbols, that very little will happen to redress the core causes of racism in the country, the discrimination that takes place? I mean, we may see cosmetic changes with flags being changed, with monuments being removed, etc. But what about redressing imbalances in the core issues like access to education, access to housing, access to jobs. Could that get lost in the mix?
I think that it absolutely does get lost in the mix. What we have here is something called tokenism, which is something that Malcolm X spoke about very much so. And what tokenism is when you have tokens or symbols that become the focus of the argument instead of the actual systemic issues and cracks in the system that are actually oppressing and killing the people that we are discussing, and people like that look like myself. And I also find it very peculiar that people say that there must be a civil discussion, especially people like Donnie, who say that there must be a civil discussion and that vandalism and things like that are just unthinkable when you clearly represent a people who started a civil war and completely separated from a country over an issue.
Right. Donnie, go ahead.
Did not. All right, first of all, the war was not fought over slavery. It's fought over what most wars was fought over, is money. The imperialist Yankee came down and was fleecing the South of money, and that's why the war was fought. Yes, slavery had something to do with it, but slavery was a cause.
So why was there not a civil discussion about it? That's what I'm saying.
Let me finish.
That's what I'm saying. Why was there not a civil discussion about it like your request?
Let me finish. I will finish this. Slavery caused a war like cars caused carjacking, and that's an issue that some people just do not want to address. They'd rather slam the South with a slur of slavery when the South does not deserve that. We did not secede in order to, quote, save the slaves.
Yeah.
I have six relatives who were Confederate soldiers who are buried in the cemetery where my mother and father is buried, and none of them were slaveholders.
Okay.
So how do you explain that?
Okay.
How do I explain that? Well, I would explain that by saying that they fought for the Confederacy, and that's all their explanation there is to it. But as far as your heritage and people that you have lost, I have lost people to current issues. You want to stay focused on a past issue and erect monuments that continue to solicit fear and send messages of racism when we're talking about current issues that are happening right now. Like the host just stated, we have current inequities in education, in housing, in quality of life, in just the general safety, even when dealing with police officers who are supposed to keep us safe. And a lot of the people who uphold these systemic issues and these systemic racism also don that flag and that Confederate motto and everything like that you seem to so vehemently believe is not related to racism at all.
Okay, I am afraid that we are going to have to leave it there. I'm sorry, we have run out of time. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.